Please welcome Vice President of Worldwide Marketing, Amazon Web Services, Ariel Kelman.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I hope you guys are having a great day here. It is my pleasure to come up on stage here, the CEO of Amazon Web Services, Andy Jassy. Okay, let's get started. I have a bunch of questions here for you, Andy.
Just like one of our meetings, Ariel.
Just like one of our meetings. So I thought I'd start with a little bit of a state of the state on AWS. Can you give us your quick take?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you everyone for being here. We really appreciate it. We know how busy you guys are, so I hope you're having a good day. The business is growing really quickly. In the last financials we released in Q4 of 16, AWS is a $14 billion revenue run rate business, growing 47% year over year. We have millions of active customers, and we consider an active customer as a non-Amazon entity that's used the platform in the last 30 days. And it's really a very broad and diverse customer set in every imaginable size of customer and every imaginable vertical business segment. And I won't repeat all the customers that I know Werner went through earlier in the keynote, but just some of the more recent ones that you've seen. Nell is moving their digital and their connected devices, meters, real estate to AWS, and McDonald's is reinventing their digital platform on top of AWS. FINRA is moving all into AWS. Yeah, you see, at reInvent, Workday announced that AWS was its preferred cloud provider and is going to start building on top of AWS further. Today, in press releases, you saw both Dunkin' Donuts and here, the geospatial map company announced they'd chosen AWS as their providers. And then I think if you look at our business, we have a really large non-US or global customer base and business that continues to expand very dramatically. And we're also aggressively increasing the number of geographic regions in which we have infrastructure. And so last year in 2016, on top of the broad footprint we added Korea and India and Canada and the UK. We've announced that we have regions coming, another one in China and Ningxia, as well as in France, as well as in Sweden. So we're not close to being done expanding geographically. And then, of course, we continue to iterate and innovate really quickly on behalf of all of you, of our customers. I mean, just last year alone, we launched what we considered over 1,000 significant services and features. So on average, our customers wake up every day and have 3 new capabilities they can choose to use or not use, but at their disposal. You've seen it already this year. If you look at Chime, which is our new unified communication service that makes meetings much easier to conduct and be productive with. You saw Connect, which is our new global call center routing service. If you look even today, you look at Redshift Spectrum, which makes it easier to query all your data, not just locally on disk in your data warehouse, but across all of S3, or DAX, which puts a cache in front of DynamoDB using the same interface, or all the new features in our machine learning services. We're not close to being done delivering and iterating on your behalf. And I think if you look at that collection of things, it's part of why, as Gartner looks out at the infrastructure space, they estimate that AWS is several times the size business of the next 14 providers combined. It's a pretty significant market segment leadership position.
So you talked a lot about adoption there. A lot of customers moving to AWS, migrating large numbers of workloads, some going all in on AWS. And with that as kind of a backdrop, do you still see a role for hybrid as being something that's important for customers?
Yeah, it's funny. The quick answer is yes. I think if you think about a few years ago, a lot of the rage was this debate about private cloud versus what people call public cloud. And we don't really see that debate very often anymore. I think relatively few companies have had success with private clouds, and most are pretty substantially moving in the direction of building on top of clouds like AWS. But while you increasingly see more and more companies every month announcing that they're going all into the cloud, we will see most enterprises operate in some form of hybrid mode for the next number of years. And I think in the early days of AWS in the cloud, I think people got confused about this, where they thought that they had to make this binary decision to either be all in on the public cloud in AWS or not at all. And of course, that's not the case. It's not a binary decision. And what we know many of our enterprise customers want is they want to be able to run the data centers that they're not ready to retire yet as seamlessly as they can alongside of AWS. And it's why we've built a lot of the capabilities we've built the last several years. These are things like VPC, which is our virtual private cloud, which allows you to cordon off a portion of our network and deploy resources into it and connect to it through VPN, or Direct Connect, which is a private connection between your data centers and our regions, or our storage gateway, which is a virtual storage appliance, or identity federation, or a whole bunch of capabilities like that. But what we've seen, even though the vast majority of the big hybrid implementations today are built on top of AWS, as more and more of the mainstream enterprises are now at the point where they're really building substantial cloud adoption plans, they've come back to us and they've said, well, you know, actually you guys have made us make kind of a binary decision. And that's because the vast majority of the world is virtualized on top of VMware. And because VMware and AWS, prior to a few months ago, had really done nothing to try and make it easy to use the VMware tools that people have been using for many years seamlessly with AWS, customers were having to make a binary choice of either they stick with the VMware tools they've used for a while, but have a really tough time integrating with AWS, or they move to AWS and they have to leave behind the VMware tools they've been using. And it really was the impetus for VMware and AWS to have a number of deep conversations about it, which led to the announcement we made late last fall of VMware and AWS, which is going to allow customers who have been using the VMware tools to manage their infrastructure for a long time to seamlessly be able to run those on top of AWS. And they get to do so as they move workloads back and forth and they evolve their hybrid implementation without having to buy any new hardware, which is a big deal for companies. Very few companies are looking to find ways to buy more hardware these days. And customers have been very excited about this prospect. We've announced that it's going to be ready in the middle of this year. And you see companies like Amadeus and Merck and Western Digital and the state of Louisiana and a number of others. We have a very large private beta and preview happening right now, and people are pretty excited by that prospect. So we will allow customers to run in the mode that they want to run, and I think you'll see a huge transition over the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay. So in addition to hybrid, another question we get a lot from enterprises is around the concept of lock-in and how they should think about their relationship with a vendor and how they should think about whether to spread their workloads across multiple infrastructure providers. How do you think about that?
Well, it's a question we get a lot, and Oracle has sure made people care about that issue. I think people are very sensitive about being locked in, given the experience that they've had over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think the reality is, when you look at the cloud, it really is nothing like being locked into something like Oracle. The APIs look pretty similar between the various providers. We build on open standards like Linux and MySQL and Postgres. All the migration tools that we build allow you to migrate in or out of AWS. It's up to customers based on how they want to run their workloads. So it is much easier to move away from something like the cloud than it is from some of the old software services that has created some of this phobia. But I think when you look at most CIOs, enterprise CIOs particularly, as they think about moving to the cloud, many of them start off thinking that they very well might split their workloads across multiple cloud providers. And I think when push comes to shove, very few decide to do so. Most predominantly pick an infrastructure provider to run their workloads. And the reason that they don't split it across, pretty evenly across clouds is a few reasons. Number one, if you do so, you have to standardize on the lowest common denominator. And these platforms are in radically different stages at this point. And if you look at something like AWS, it has a lot more functionality than anybody else by a large margin. And we're also iterating more quickly than you'll find from the other providers. And most folks don't want to tie the hands of their developers behind their backs in the name of having the ability of splitting it across multiple clouds, because they actually are, in most of their spaces, it's competitive, and they have a lot of ideas that they want to actually build and invent on behalf of their customers. So, they don't want to actually limit their functionality. It turns out the second reason is that they don't want to force their development teams to have to learn multiple platforms. And most development teams, if any of you have managed multiple stacks across different technologies, and many of us have had that experience, it's a pain in the butt. And trying to make a shift from what you've been doing for the last 30 years on premises to the cloud is hard enough. But then forcing teams to have to get good at running across 2 or 3 platforms is something most teams don't relish, and it's wasteful of people's time, it's wasteful of financial resources. So that's the second thing. And then the third reason is that you effectively diminish your buying power, because all of these cloud providers have volume discounts, and then you're splitting what you buy across multiple providers, which gives you, a lower amount you're buying from everybody and a worse price. So when most CIOs and enterprises look at this carefully, they don't actually end up splitting it relatively evenly. They predominantly pick a cloud provider. Some will just pick one. Others will pick one and then do a little bit with a second, just so they know they can run with a second provider in case that relationship with the one they choose to predominantly run with goes sideways in some fashion. But when you really look at it, CIOs are not making that decision to split it up relatively evenly, because it makes their development teams much less capable and much less agile.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about a subject that's on the minds of not just enterprises, but startups and government organizations, and pretty much every organization we talk to, and that's AI and machine learning. reInvent, we introduced our Amazon AI services, and just this morning, Werner announced the general availability of Amazon Lex. So where are we overall on machine learning?
Well, it's a hugely exciting opportunity for customers, and I think we believe it's exciting for us as well. And it's still in the relatively early stages if you look at how people are using it, but it's something that we passionately believe is going to make a huge difference in the world and a huge difference with customers, and that we're investing a pretty gigantic amount of resource and capability for our customers. And I think the way that we think about at a high level, the machine learning and deep learning spaces are, there's kind of 3 macro layers of the stack. I think at that bottom layer, it's generally for the expert machine learning practitioners, of which there are relatively few in the world. It's a scarce resource relative to what I think will be the case in 5 to 10 years from now. And these are folks who are comfortable working with deep learning engines, know how to build models, know how to tune those models, know how to do inference, know how to get that data from the models into production apps. And for that group of people, if you look at the vast majority of machine learning and deep learning that's being done in the cloud today, it's being done on top of AWS on our P2 instances, which are optimized for deep learning, and our deep learning AMIs that package effectively the deep learning engines and libraries inside those AMIs. And you see companies like Netflix and NVIDIA and Pinterest and Stanford and a whole bunch of others that are doing significant amounts of machine learning on top of those optimized instances for machine learning and the deep learning AMIs. And I think that you can expect over time that we'll continue to build additional capabilities and tools for those expert practitioners. I think we will support and do support every single one of the deep learning engines on top of AWS, and we have a significant amount of those workloads with all those engines running on top of AWS today. We also are making, I would say, a disproportionate investment of our own resources in the MXNet community, just because if you look at running deep learning models, once you get beyond a few GPUs, it's pretty difficult to have those scale as you get into the hundreds of GPUs. And most of the deep learning engines don't scale very well horizontally. And so what we've found through a lot of extensive testing, because remember, Amazon has thousands of deep learning experts inside the company that have built very sophisticated deep learning capabilities, like the ones you see in Alexa. we have found that MXNet scales the best and almost linearly as we continue to add nodes, as we continue to horizontally scale. And so we have a lot of investment at that bottom layer of the stack. Now, if you think about most companies with developers, it's still largely inaccessible to them to do the type of machine learning and deep learning that they'd really like to do. And that's because the tools, I think, are still too primitive. And there's a number of services out there. We've built one ourselves in Amazon Machine Learning that we have a lot of customers use. And yet, I would argue that all of those services, including our own, are still more difficult than they should be for everyday developers to be able to build machine learning and access machine learning and deep learning. And if you look at the history of what AWS has done in every part of our business, and a lot of what's driven us is trying to democratize technologies that were really only available and accessible before to a select small number of companies. And so we're doing a lot of work at what I would call that middle layer of the stack to get rid of a lot of the muck associated with having to do, building the models, tuning the models, doing the inference, figuring out how to get the data into production apps. A lot of those capabilities at that middle layer that we think are really essential to allow deep learning and machine learning to reach its full potential. And then at the top layer of the stack, we think of those as solutions. And those are things like, pass me an image and I'll tell you what that image is, or show me this face and does it match faces in this group of faces, or pass me a string of text and I'll give you an MPEG file, or give me some words and what your intent is, and then I'll be able to return answers that allow people to build conversational apps like the Lex technology. And we have a whole bunch of other services coming in that area on top of Lex and Poly and recognition. And you can imagine some of those that we've had to use in Amazon over the years that we'll continue to make available for you, our customers. So very significant level of investment in all three layers of that stack. We think it's relatively early days in the space, but have a lot of passion and excitement about it.
Okay. Now for ML and AI, we're seeing customers wanting to load in tons of data, both to train the models and to actually process data once they've built their models. And then outside of ML and AI, we're seeing just as much demand to move in data for analytics and traditional workloads. So as people are looking to move more and more data to the cloud, how are we thinking about making it easier to get data in?
It's a great question, and it's I think it's actually an often overlooked question, because a lot of what gets attention with customers is all the really interesting services that allow you to do everything from compute and storage and database and messaging and analytics and machine learning and AI. But at the end of the day, if you have a significant amount of data already somewhere else, you have to get it into the cloud to be able to take advantage of all of these capabilities that you don't have on premises. And so we have spent a disproportionate amount of focus over the last few years trying to build capabilities for our customers to make this easier. And we have a set of capabilities that really is not close to matched anywhere else, in part because we have so many customers who are asking for help in this area that it's, that's really what drives what we build. And so, of course, you can use the good old-fashioned wire to send data over the internet. Increasingly, we find customers that are trying to move large amounts of data into S3 is using our S3 transfer acceleration service, which basically uses our points of presence or POPs all over the world to expedite delivery into S3. A few years ago, we were talking to a number of companies that were looking to make big shifts to the cloud, and they said, well, I need to move lots of data that just isn't viable for me to move it over the wire, given the connection we can assign to it. And it's why we built Snowball. And so we launched Snowball a couple of years ago, which is really, it's a 50 terabyte appliance that is encrypted. The data is encrypted 3 different ways. And it's, you ingest the data from your data center into a Snowball. It has a Kindle connected to it. It allows you to, that makes sure that you set it to the right place, and you can also track the progress of your high-speed ingestion into our data centers. And when we first launched Snowball, we launched it at reInvent a couple of years ago, I could not believe that we were going to order as many Snowballs to start with as the team wanted to order. And in fact, I approached the team and I said, this is way too much. Why don't we first see if people actually use any of these Snowballs? And so the team, thankfully, didn't listen very carefully to that, and they really only pared back a little bit. And then it turned out that we, almost from the get-go, had ordered 10x too few. And so this has been something that people have used in a very broad and pervasive way all over the world. And last year, at the beginning of the year, as we were asking people what else they would like us to build in Snowball, customers told us a few things that were pretty interesting to us. First, one that wasn't that surprising was they said, well, it'd be great if they were bigger. If instead of 50 terabytes, it was more data I could store on each device. Then they said, one of the problems is when I load the data onto a Snowball and I send it to you, I have to still keep my local copy on premises until it's ingested because I can't risk losing that data. So they said it'd be great if you could find a way to provide clustering so that I don't have to keep that copy on premises. And that was pretty interesting. And then they said, there's some of that data that I'd actually like to be loading synchronously to S3, or some things back from S3 to that data that I may want to compare against. That was interesting, having that endpoint. And then they said, well, we'd really love it if there was some compute on those Snowballs so I can do analytics on some relatively short-term signals that I want to take action on right away. And those were really the pieces of feedback that informed Snowball Edge, which is the next version of Snowball that we launched and announced at reInvent this past November. And so it's a 100 terabyte appliance, still the same level of encryption. It has clustering so that you don't have to keep that copy of the data local. It allows you to have an endpoint to S3 to synchronously load data back and forth. And then it has compute inside of it. And so it allows customers to use these on premises. I'll give you a good example. GE is using these for their wind turbines, and they collect all kinds of data from those turbines, but there's certain short-term signals they want to do analytics on in as close to real time as they can and take action on those. And so they use that compute to do the analytics, and then when they fill up that Snowball Edge, they detach it and send it back to AWS to do broad-scale analytics in the cloud, and then just start using an additional Snowball Edge to capture that short-term data and be able to do those analytics. So Snowball Edge is, we just launched it a couple months ago. Again, amazed at the type of response and how many customers are starting to deploy those all over the place. I think if you have exabytes of data that you need to move, it's not so easy. An exabyte of data, if you wanted to move from on-premise to AWS, would require 10,000 Snowball Edges. Most customers don't want to really manage a fleet of 10,000 Snowball Edges if they don't have to. And so we tried to figure out how to solve that problem, and it's why we launched Snowmobile back at reInvent in November, which effectively, it's a 100 petabyte container on a 45-foot trailer that we will take a truck and bring out to your facility. It comes with its own power and its own network fiber that we plug into your data center. And if you want to move an exabyte of data over a 10 gigabit per second connection, it would take you 26 years. But using 10 snowmobiles, it'll take you 6 months. So really different level of scale. And you'd be surprised how many companies have exabytes of data at this point that they want to move to the cloud to get all those analytics and machine learning capabilities running on top of them. Then for streaming data, as we have more and more companies that are doing real-time analytics of streaming data, we have Kinesis, where we built something called the Kinesis Firehose that makes it really simple to stream all your real-time data. We have a storage gateway for companies that want to keep certain data hot locally and then asynchronously be loading the rest of their data to AWS to be able to use in different formats should they need it as backup or should they choose to make a transition. So it's a very broad set of storage capabilities. And then, of course, if you moved a lot of data into the cloud or into anything, you realize that one of the hardest parts that people often leave to the end is ETL. And so we have announced an ETL service called Glue, which we announced at reInvent, which is going to make it much easier to move your data, be able to find your data, map your data to different locations and do ETL, which of course is hugely important as you move in large amounts.
So we've talked a lot about moving things to the cloud, moving applications, moving data, but let's shift gears a little bit and talk about something not on the cloud, connected devices.
Yeah.
Where do they fit in and how do you think about edge?
Well, it's in the time I've been working on AWS since the start of AWS, and we've been in the market for a little over 11 years at this point, and we have encountered, as I'm sure all of you have, many buzzwords. And of all the buzzwords that everybody has talked about, I think I can make a pretty strong argument that the one that has delivered fastest on its promise has been IoT and connected devices. Just amazing to me how much is happening at the edge today and how fast that's changing with device manufacturers. And I think that if you look out 10 years from now, when you talk about hybrid, I think most companies' majority on-premise piece of hybrid will not be servers. It will be connected devices. There are going to be billions of devices all over the place, in your home, in your office, in factories, in oil fields, in agricultural fields, on ships, in cars, in planes, everywhere. You're going to have these assets that sit at the edge that companies are going to want to be able to collect data on, do analytics on, and then take action. And if you think about it, most of these devices, by their very nature, have relatively little CPU and have relatively little disk, which makes the cloud disproportionately important for them to supplement them. It's why you see most of the big, successful IoT applications today are using AWS to supplement them. You know, Illumina has hooked up their genome sequencing to AWS to do analytics, or you can look at, you know, Major League Baseball StatCast is an IoT application built on top of AWS, or John Deere has over 200,000 telematically enabled tractors that are collecting real-time planting conditions and information that they're doing analytics on and sending it back to farmers so they can figure out where and how to optimally plant. Tata Motors manages their truck fleet this way. Philips has their smart lighting project. I mean, there are innumerable amounts of these IoT applications built on top of AWS where the cloud is supplementing the device's capability. But when you think about these becoming more mission-critical applications for companies, there are going to be certain functions and certain conditions by which they're not going to want to connect back to the cloud. They're not going to want to take the time for that round trip. They're not going to have connectivity in some cases to be able to make a round trip to the cloud. And what they really want is customers really want the same capabilities they have in AWS with AWS IoT, but on the devices themselves. And if you've ever tried to develop on these embedded devices, it's not for mere mortals. It's pretty delicate and it's pretty scary, and there's a lot of archaic protocols associated with it. Pretty tough to do it all and to do without taking down your application. And so what we did was we built something called Greengrass, and we announced it at reInvent. And Greengrass is really like a software module that you can effectively have inside your device. And it allows developers to write Lambda functions. It's got Lambda inside of it. And it allows customers to write Lambda functions, some of which they want to run in the cloud, and some of which they want to run on the device itself through Greengrass. So they have a common programming model to build those functions, to take the signals they see and take the actions they want to take against that, which is really going to help, I think, across all of these IoT devices to be able to be much more flexible and allow the devices and the analytics and the actions you take to be much smarter and more intelligent. It's also why we built Snowball Edge. Snowball Edge, if you think about it, is really a purpose-built Greengrass device where we have Greengrass inside of a Snowball Edge, and the GE wind turbine example is a good example of that. And so it's, to us, I think it's the future of what the on-premises piece of hybrid's going to be. I think there are going to be billions of devices all over the place. People are going to want to interact with them with a common programming model like they use in AWS in the cloud, and we're continuing to invest very significantly to make that easier and easier for companies.
Okay. We've talked about several future directions. We talked about AI, machine learning, the edge. What are some of the other areas of investment that this group should hear about?
Well, there's a lot. That's not a soup question, Oriel. But there's a lot. I think I'll name a few. I think, first of all, as I alluded to earlier, we are not close to being done expanding geographically. I think virtually every tier 1 country will have an AWS region over time, and I think many of the emerging countries will as well. I think the database space is an area that is radically changing. It's happening at a faster pace than I think people sometimes realize, and I think it's good news for all of you. I think the database space over the last few decades has been a lonely place for customers. I think that they have felt particularly locked into companies that are expensive and proprietary and have high degrees of lock-in and aren't so customer friendly. And I think customers are sick of it. And we have a relational database service that we launched many years ago, and has many flavors that you can run. You can run MySQL, you can run Postgres, you can run MariaDB, you can run SQL Server, you can run Oracle. And what a lot of our customers kept saying to us was, could you please figure out a way to have a database capability that has the performance characteristics of the commercial grade databases, but the customer friendly and pricing model of the more open engines like the MySQL and Postgres and MariaDB, which you can do on your own. We do a lot of it at Amazon, but it's hard. I mean, it takes a lot of work and a lot of tuning, and our customers really wanted us to solve that problem for them. And it's why we spent several years building Aurora, which is our own database engine that we built, but that's fully compatible with MySQL and with Postgres. It's at least as fault tolerant and durable and performant as the commercial grade databases, but it's a tenth of the cost of those. And it's also nice because if it turns out that you use Aurora and you decide for whatever reason you don't want to use Aurora anymore, because it's fully compatible with MySQL and Postgres, you just dump it to the community versions of those and off you are. And so there's really hardly any transition there. So that is the fastest growing service in the history of AWS. I'm amazed at how quickly it's growing. I think you may have heard earlier, we've had 23,000 database migrations just in the last year or so. There's a lot of pent-up demand to have database freedom, and we're here to help you have it. I think on the analytics side, it's just never been easier and less expensive to collect, store, analyze, and share data than it is today. And part of that has to do with the economics of the cloud, but a lot of it has to do with the really broad analytics capability that we provide you. And it's a much broader capability than you'll find elsewhere. And you can do Manage Hadoop and Spark and Presto and Hive and Pig and Yarn on top of AWS, or we have a managed Elasticsearch service. And of course, we have a very high scale, very high performing data warehouse in Redshift that just got even more performant with Spectrum, which now can query across all of your S3 data. And of course, you have Athena, where you can query S3 directly. We have a service that allows you to do real-time analytics of streaming data in Kinesis. We have a business intelligence service in QuickSight. We have a number of machine learning capabilities I talked about earlier. It's a very broad array. And what we find is that it's a new day in analytics for companies. A lot of the data that companies felt like they had to throw away before, either because it was too expensive to hold, or they didn't really have the tools accessible to them to get the learnings in that data. It's a totally different day today. And so we have a pretty big investment in that space. I mentioned Glue earlier to do ETL and all that data. We have a lot more coming in that space. I think compute, super interesting. I think we will find that companies will use full instances for many, many years. And we have more than double the number of instances than you'll find elsewhere in every imaginable shape and size. But I would also say that the trend we see is that more and more companies are using smaller units of compute. And it's why you see containers becoming so popular. We have a really big business in ECS, and we will continue to build out the capability there. We have companies really running virtually every type of container and orchestration and management service on top of AWS at this point. And then, of course, a couple of years ago, we pioneered the event-driven serverless capability in compute that we call Lambda, which I'm just, again, blown away by how many customers are using that for everything, in every way. So I think the basic unit of compute is continuing to get smaller. I think it's really good for customers. I think the ability to be serverless is a very exciting proposition that we're continuing to fulfill that vision that we laid out a couple of years ago. And then, probably the last thing I'd point out right now is I think it's really interesting to see how the basic procurement of software is changing, in significant part driven by what we've been doing with our marketplace. Now, if you think about it, in the old world, if you were a company that was buying software, you'd have to go find a bunch of the companies that you should consider. You'd have to have a lot of conversations. You'd have to talk to a lot of salespeople. Those companies, by the way, have to have a big sales team and an expensive marketing budget to go find those companies and then go sell those companies. And then both companies engage in this long tap dance around doing an agreement and the legal terms and the legal teams. And it's just the process is very arduous. Then after you buy it, you have to figure out how you're going to actually package it, how you're going to deploy it to infrastructure and get it done. And it's just, I think in general, both consumers of software and sellers of software really don't like the process that's existed over the last few decades. And then you look at the AWS marketplace, and we have 3,500 product listings in there from 1,200 technology providers. If you look at the number of hours of that software that's been run on EC2, just in the last month alone, it's several 100 million hours, EC2 hours of that software being run on top of our marketplace. And it's just completely changing how software is bought and procured. I think that if you talk to a lot of the big sellers of software, like Splunk or Trend Micro, there's a whole number of them, they'll tell you it totally changes their ability to be able to sell. One of the things that really helped AWS in the early days and still continues to help us is that we have a self-service model where we don't actually have to have a lot of people talk to every customer to get started. I think if you're a seller of software, that's very appealing to allow people to find your software and be able to buy it. And if you're a consumer, to be able to buy it quickly, again, without the hassle of all those conversations and the overhead associated with that, very appealing. And I think it's why the marketplace has just exploded and taken off like it has. It's also really good, by the way, for systems integrators who are often packaging things on top of that software to their clients. This makes it much easier to build kind of smaller catalogs of software products for their customers. I think when you layer on top of that the capabilities that we've announced and making it easier for SaaS providers to meter and to do billing and to do identity, it's a very different world. And so I think that also is very exciting, both for companies and customers as well as software providers.
We've certainly touched on a lot here, and we have a lot going on. And while we have customers asking us a lot about how they can use all these new services and new features, we also tend to get a lot of questions from customers on how we innovate so quickly and how they can think about applying some of those lessons learned to their own businesses.
So you're asking how we're able to innovate quickly? Mm-hmm. I think there's a few things that have helped us, and it's different for every company, but some of these might be helpful. But I point to a few. I think the first thing is, I think we disproportionately index in hiring builders. And we think of builders as people who are inventors, people who look at different customer experiences really critically, are honest about what's flawed about them, and then seek to reinvent them. And then people who understand that launch is the starting line and not the finish line. There's very little that any of us ever build that's a home run right out of the gate. And so most things that succeed take a lot of listening to customers and a lot of experimentation and a lot of iterating before you get to an equation that really works. So the first thing is who we hire. I think the second thing is how we organize. And we have, at Amazon, long tried to organize into as small and separable and autonomous teams as we can that have all the resources in those teams to own their own destiny. And so, for instance, the technologists and the product managers are part of the same team. And a lot of that is because we don't want the finger pointing that goes back and forth between the teams. And if they're on the same team, they focus all of their energy on owning it together and understanding what customers need from them, spending a disproportionate amount of time with customers, and then they get to own their own roadmaps. One of the reasons we don't publish a 12 to 18-month roadmap is we want those teams to have the freedom in talking to customers and listening to what you tell us matters to reprioritize if there are certain things that we assumed mattered more than it turns out it does. So I think that the way that we organize is a second piece. I think a third piece is all of our teams get to use the same AWS building blocks that all of you get to use, which allow you to move much more quickly. And I think one of the least told stories about Amazon over the last 5 years, in part because people have gotten interested in AWS, is people have missed how fast our consumer business at Amazon has iterated. Look at the amount of invention in Amazon's consumer business, and they'll tell you that a big piece of that is their ability to use the AWS building blocks like they do. I think a fourth thing is, at many big companies, as they get larger, what starts to happen is what people call the institutional no, which is that leaders walk into meetings on new ideas looking to find ways to say no. And not because they're ill-intended, but just because they get more conservative, or they have a lot on their plate, or things are really managed very centrally, so it's hard to imagine adding more to what you're already doing. At Amazon, it's really the opposite, and in part because of the way we're organized in such a decoupled, decentralized fashion, and in part because it's just part of our DNA. When the leaders walk into a meeting, they are looking for ways to say yes. And we don't say yes to everything. We have a lot of proposals, but we say yes to a lot more than I think virtually any other company on the planet. And when we're having conversations with builders who are proposing new ideas, we're in a mode where we're trying to problem solve with them to get to yes, which I think is really different. And then I think the last thing is that we have mechanisms inside the company that allow us to make fast decisions. And if you want a little bit more detail, you should read our founder and CEO, Jeff Bezos' shareholder letter, which just was released. He talks about the fast decision-making that happens inside the company. It's really true. We make fast decisions, and we're willing to fail. And we sometimes talk about how we're working on several of our next biggest failures. And we hope that most of the things we're doing aren't going to fail. But we know if you're going to push the envelope and if you're going to experiment at the rate that we're trying to experiment to find more pillars that allow us to do more for customers and allow us to be more relevant, you are going to fail sometimes. And you have to accept that. And you have to have a way of evaluating people that recognizes the inputs, meaning the things that they actually delivered as opposed to the outputs, because on new ventures, you don't know what the outputs are going to be. You don't know if consumers or customers are going to respond to the new thing you're trying to build. So you have to be able to reward employees and the inputs. You have to have a way for them to continue to progress and grow in their career, even if they worked on something that didn't work. And you have to have a way of thinking about when things don't work, how do I take the technology that I built that's part of that really actually does work, but I didn't get it right in the form factor, and use it for other things. And I think that when you think about a culture like Amazon that disproportionately hires builders, organizes into these separable, autonomous teams, that allows them to use building blocks to move fast, that has a leadership team that's looking to say yes to ideas and is willing to fail, you end up finding not only do you do more inventing, but you get the people at every level of the organization spending their free cycles thinking about new ideas, because it actually pays to think of those new ideas because you get a shot to try it. And so that has really helped us, and I think most of our customers who've made significant shifts to AWS in the cloud would argue that that's one of the big transformational things they've seen in their companies as well.
Okay. I want to go a little bit deeper on the subject of culture. What are some of the things that are most unique about the AWS culture that companies should know about when they're looking to partner with us?
Well, I think if you're making a decision on a predominant infrastructure provider, it's really important that you decide that the culture of the company you're going to partner with is a fit for yours. And it's a super important decision that you don't want to have to redo multiple times because it's wasted effort. And I think that, look, I've been at Amazon for almost 20 years at this point, so I have obviously drank the Kool-Aid. But there are a few things that I think are truly unique about Amazon's culture. I'll talk about three of them. The first is, I think that we are unusually customer-oriented. And I think a lot of companies talk about being customer-oriented, but few actually are. I think most of the big technology companies, truthfully, are competitor-focused. They kind of look at what competitors are doing, and then they try to kind of one-up one another. You have one or two of them that I would say are product focused, where they say, hey, it's great, that you, Mr. or Mrs. Customer, have ideas on the product, but leave that to the experts, and you'll like the products we're going to build. And those strategies can be good ones and successful ones. They're just not ours. We are driven by what customers tell us matters to them. We don't build technology for technology's sake. We don't become, smitten by any one technology. We're trying to solve real problems for our customers. 90% of what we build is driven by what you tell us matters. And the other 10% is listening to you. And even if you can't articulate exactly what you want, trying to read between the lines and event on your behalf. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that we are pioneers. We really like to invent, as I was talking about earlier. And I think most big technology companies at this point have either lost their will or their DNA to invent. Most of them acquire it or fast follow. And again, that can be a successful strategy. It's just not ours. I think in this day and age where we're going through as big a shift as we are in the cloud, which is the biggest technology shift in our lifetime, as dynamic as it is, being able to partner with a company that has the most functionality, it's iterating the fastest, has the most customers, has the largest ecosystem of partners, as SIs and ISVs, that has had a vision for how all these pieces fit together from the start instead of trying to patch them together in a following act, you have a big advantage. And then I think the third thing is that we're unusually long-term oriented. And I think that you won't ever see us show up at your door the last day of a quarter or the last day of a year trying to harass you into doing some kind of deal with us, not to be heard from again for a couple of years when we either audit you or try to re-up you for a deal. That's just not the way that we will ever operate. And we are trying to build a business and a set of relationships that outlast all of us here. And I think something that always ties it together well is this trusted advisor capability that we have inside our support function, which is, we look at dozens of programmatic ways that our customers are using the platform and reach out to you if you're doing something we think is suboptimal. And one of the things we do is, if you're not fully utilizing resources or not using them at all, we'll reach out and say, hey, you should stop paying for this. And over the last couple of years, we've sent out a couple million of these notifications that have led to actual annualized savings for customers of $350 million. So I ask you, how many of your technology partners reach out to you and say, stop spending money with us, to the tune of $350 million of lost revenue per year? Not too many. And I think when we first started doing it, people thought it was gimmicky. But if you understand what I just talked about with regard to our culture, it makes perfect sense. We don't want to make money from customers unless you're getting value. We want to reinvent an experience that we think has been broken for the prior few decades. And then we're trying to build a relationship with you that outlasts all of us. And we think the best way to do that is to provide value and do right by customers over a long period of time.
Okay. Well, keeping going on the culture subject, what about some of the quirky things about Amazon's culture that people might find interesting or useful?
Well, there are a lot of quirky parts to our culture. And I think lots of companies who have strong culture will argue they have quirky pieces. But, I think there's a few I might point to. I think the first would be, the first several years I was at the company, I guess the first 6 years or so I was at the company, like most companies, all of the information that was presented was via PowerPoint. And we would find that it was a very inefficient way to consume information. You were often shaded by the charisma of the presenter. Sometimes you would overweight what the presenter said based on whether they were a good presenter, and vice versa. You would very rarely have a deep conversation because you have no room on PowerPoint slides to have any depth. You would interrupt the presenter constantly with questions that they hadn't really thought through because they didn't think they were going to have to present that level of depth. You would constantly have you'd ask the question, I'm going to get to that in 5 slides. You want to do that now, or you want to do that in 5 slides? It was maddening. And we would often find that most of the meetings required multiple meetings. And so we made a decision as a company to effectively ban PowerPoints as a communication vehicle inside the company. Really, the only time I do PowerPoints is at reInvent. And maybe that shows. And what we found is that it's a much more substantive and effective and time-efficient way to have conversations, because there is no way to fake depth in a 6-page narrative. So what we went to from a PowerPoint was a 6-page narrative. You can write, you can have as much as you want in an appendix, but you have to assume nobody will read the appendices. Everything you have to communicate has to be done in 6 pages. You can't fake depth in a 6-page narrative. And so what we do is we all get to the room, we spend 20 minutes or so reading the document so it's fresh in everybody's head. And then where we start the conversation is a radically different spot than when you're hearing a presentation, one kind of shallow slide at a time. We all start the conversation with a fair bit of depth on the topic, and we can really hone in on the 3 or 4 issues that typically matter in each of these conversations. So we get to the heart of the matter, and we can have one meeting on the topic instead of 3 or 4. So that has been really, I mean, it's unusual and it takes some time getting used to, but it is a much more effective way to pay attention to the detail and have substantive conversation. You know, I think a second thing, if you look at our working backwards process, we don't write a line of code for any of our services until we write and refine and decide we have crisp press release and frequently asked question, or FAQ, for that product. And in the press release, what we're trying to do is make sure that we're building a product that has benefits that will really matter. How many times have we all gotten to the end of products, and by the time we get there, we kind of think about what we're launching and think, this is not that interesting. Like, people are not going to find this that compelling. And it's because you just haven't thought through and argued and debated and made sure that you drew the line in the right spot on a set of benefits that will really matter to customers. So that's why we use the press release. The FAQ is to really have the arguments up front about how you're building the product. So what technology are you using? What's the architecture? What's the customer experience? What's the UI look like? What's the pricing dimensions? Are you going to charge for it or not? All of those decisions, you know, what are people going to be most excited about? What are people going to be most disappointed by? All those conversations, if you have them up front, even if it takes you a few times to go through it, you can just let the teams build, and you don't have to check in with them except on the dates. And so we find that if we take the time up front, we not only get the products right more often, but the teams also deliver much more quickly and with much less churn. And then the third thing I'd say it's kind of quirky is it is an unusually truth-seeking culture at Amazon. And I think we have a leadership principle that we say, have backbone, disagree, and commit. And what it means is that we really expect people to speak up if they believe that we're headed down a path that's wrong for customers. No matter who is advancing it, what level in the company, everybody is empowered and expected to speak up. And then once we have the debate, then we all have to pull the same way, even if it's a different way than you were advocating. And I think you always hear that old adage of where 2 people look at a ceiling and one person says it's 14 feet, and another person says it's 10 feet, and they say, okay, let's compromise, it's 12 feet. And of course, it's not 12 feet, there is an answer. And not all the things that we all consider has that black and white answer, but most things have an answer that really is more right if you actually assess it and debate it. And so we have an environment that really empowers people to challenge one another. And I think it's part of why we end up getting to better answers, because we have that level of openness and rigor.
Okay. Well, Andy, we have time for one more question.
Okay.
So other than some of the things you've talked about, like customer focus, innovation, long-term orientation, what is the single most important lesson that you've learned that is really relevant to this audience in this time we're living in?
There's a lot, but I'll pick one. I would say, I'll tell a short story that I think captures it. When I, in the early days of Amazon, our sole business was what we called an owned inventory retail business, which meant we bought the inventory from distributors or publishers or manufacturers, stored it in our own fulfillment centers, and then shipped it to customers. And around the year 1990 or 1999 or 2000, this third-party seller model started becoming very popular. These were companies like Half.com and eBay and folks like that. And we had a really animated debate inside the company about whether we should allow third-party sellers to sell on the Amazon site. And the concerns internally were, first of all, we just had this fundamental belief that other sellers weren't going to care as much about the customer experience as we did, because that was such a central part of everything we did DNA-wise. And then, also we had this entire business and all of this machinery that was built around owned inventory business, with all of these relationships with publishers and distributors and manufacturers who we didn't think would necessarily like third-party sellers selling right alongside us, having bought their products. And so we really debated this. And we ultimately decided that we were going to allow third-party sellers to sell in our marketplace. And we made that decision in part because it was better for customers. It allowed them to have lower prices, so more price variety and better selection. But also in significant part because we realized you can't fight gravity. If something is going to happen, whether you want it to happen or not, it is going to happen. And you are much better off cannibalizing yourself or being ahead of whatever direction the world is headed than you are at howling at the wind or wishing it away or trying to put up blockers and find a way to delay moving to the model that is really most successful and has the most amount of benefits for the customers in question. And that turned out to be a really important lesson for Amazon as a company and for me personally as well. We had, in the early days of doing marketplace, we had all kinds of folks, even after we made the decision, that despite the backbone, disagree, and commit, weren't really sure that they believed that was going to be a successful decision. And it took several months, but thankfully, we really were vigilant about it. And today, roughly half of the units we sell in our retail business are third-party seller units. It's been really good for our customers and really good for our business as well. And I think the same thing is really applicable to the space we're talking about today, to the cloud. And as you think about this gigantic shift that's going on right now, moving to the cloud, which is, I think in the early days of the cloud, the first, I'll call it 6, 7, 8 years, I think collectively we consumed so much energy with all of these arguments about, are people going to move to the cloud? What are they going to move to the cloud? Will they move mission-critical applications to the cloud? Will the enterprise adopt it? Will public sector adopt it? What about private cloud? We just consumed a huge amount of energy. And, it was, you can see both in the results in what's happening in businesses like ours. It was a form of fighting gravity. And today, we don't really have if conversations anymore with our customers. They're all when and how and in what order conversations. And I would say that this is going to be a much better world for all of us because we will be able to build in a much more cost-effective fashion. We will be able to build much more quickly. We'll be able to take our scarce resource in engineers and not spend their resource on the undifferentiated heavy lifting of infrastructure and instead on what truly differentiates your business. And you'll have a global presence so that you have lower latency and a better end user customer experience being deployed with your applications and infrastructure all over the world, and you'll be able to meet the data sovereignty requirements of various locales. So I think it's a great world that we're entering right now. I think we're at a time where there's a lot less confusion about where the world is headed, and I think it's an unprecedented opportunity for you to reinvent your businesses, reinvent your applications, and build capabilities for your customers and for your business that weren't easily possible before. And I hope you take advantage of it, and we'll be right here every step of the way to help you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time today.
Thank you.